So we're going to do a little bit more work with this application. Specifically, we've only in the view done echoing. And it would be nice, since we have two Pokemon in our system, to actually output those two Pokemon. And so go back over here. This is the view that we've been working with. Right now we have this echo statement here. We had this debugging statement here. I could debug the entire Pokemon object, and I could see my two Pokemon. And so this is Pokemon number 1, which is Bulbasaur, and we have Pokemon number 2, which is right here, Ivysaur. I would like to loop through those and display them, and this will feel fairly reminiscent of working in PHP. I'm going to open up a embedded Ruby block. Notice that I'm not using an equal sign here. When I use an embedded Ruby block with an equal sign, that's an echo statement. So I'm requesting that what's within this block is evaluated, and what is the evaluated value will be echoed into the document. Here what I want to do is I want to go to Pokemon, and for each of them I want to loop over them, and I'll call each thing P. And then I need an associated end. And so the creator of Rails, David Heinemeier Hansen, took much of this syntax directly from how PHP handles templating. So DHH is the short form of his name. DHH was a PHP programmer before he created Rails, and he really liked how PHP handled templating. And so ERB is very reminiscent of that style of templating, where we sort of jump in and out of embedded programming language and HTML. And so this is embedded Ruby, this is embedded Ruby, but in the middle here, we're back into HTML mode. And so if I put a paragraph tag in here, and I said, this is a paragraph, because I have two Pokemon in my system, this loop is going to loop over each one of them, and for each one, a paragraph tag will show up in my output document. So I should see this is a paragraph twice in the output document because I have two Pokemon in the database. So if I go back over here and reload the page, this is a paragraph, this is a paragraph. So that's working well. The loop is doing the right thing, but I don't just want this is a paragraph. I'd actually like the information that's contained inside of each one of these objects, these P objects. And so I could, for example, inside of an H3, I could echo out the Pokemon's name, close my H3, and then inside of this paragraph, I could, within a strong tag, let's say I line that up and I say hit points.
So how does it close your tags?
It doesn't. I'm sure I could get a plugin for that. Yeah. And then P dot hit points. And so now for each loop, I'm going to be generating an H3, echoing in the name. Again, I'm using the equal sign for that echo, then a paragraph tag and another echoing for the hit points. Back over to here. We see our two different, I didn't close one of my things, didn't I? Why are you looking all the same size? Well, that's fine. This is just an H3, happens to be the same almost size as the rest of it. And there you go. If I was to go to, for example, over to my console here and create a new Pokemon, Pokemon.create, name, and here I could go and pick the next Pokemon in the list, hit points of 80, paste that in, hit points are 80. I've now created a third Pokemon, so back over here, reload the page, and there is the third one showing up. So it just grabs all the availables, looping through them, displaying the information about those particular Pokemon. Any initial questions or comments about ERB? So we can also, this is just an example with an each statement, this is an example with an echo. We could also, for example, have an if statement, right? So maybe I could say if, let's say maybe Pokemon.count is 0, then there are no Pokemon. Else, end. So again, jumping back and forth between embedded Ruby and HTML in this kind of templated way. So if this is true, we'll see this message. Otherwise, we'll see this message, in which case we'll echo the count into there. Shouldn't change my output because there are not 0 Pokemon. And so there they go. There's the output. If I was to truncate my database down to 0, we would see this appear. So just like in PHP, really when we're in this mode of templating, you should not be doing any real programming work. You shouldn't be performing calculations in a view. You shouldn't be, you most especially should not be communicating with the model here. So you shouldn't ever have something like Pokemon.all.each. That'll work. You do have access to the model within your views. It's just poor form to have model calls in your views, because if someone else is coming onto your project, they're going to make the assumption that it's the controller that always goes to the model, not that you're ever making direct calls from your views. So it's convention to never have a direct call to a model within a view. You're not stopped from doing so, but it's not good form. Really all that should be in here are echo statements, decisions to conditionally show or hide information, and loops. That's going to be the primary sort of set of things that you might have inside of a view in terms of embedded Ruby. And then all of that, of course, all the extra embedded Ruby markup goes away when the final document is actually sent to the end user. All that's left is the generated HTML. And so this is the generated HTML with the number 3 in it. Each one of these is the generated HTML that's being manufactured in our loop. Okay, the only other thing that I don't think I showed yet is, of course, over at the model. Oh wait, let me do a quick git commit here. So git add, git commit minus m. Notice I've been editing. I should set up Atom to always be in Linux mode. I've put a bunch of Windows style line endings into my repository here. Git commit. You can actually set up Git to strip those out automatically for you when you commit. Git commit minus m. Added a additional section view for 0 on now. This is the Pokemon model. And so just like when we were working with Active Record outside of the context of Rails, we could add things in here. Like, for example, we could add in validations. So I could say validates that both the name and the hit points have a presence of true. And so now if I was to go and try to create a Pokemon over at my console here that didn't match those validations, it will be like there's a guard in front of my database. It won't actually persist. One thing you need to know about, if you have a running console like this is the Rails C running, it doesn't know about updates to your models unless you type reload exclamation mark. And now it does. And so if I try to do a create here where I, have left out the hit points, it rolls that back immediately, and I'm left with a Pokemon object that has not been persisted to memory because it did not pass validation. And if it has both of those things, then it will make it through and be persisted into the database. So that's all the same. We can also create methods on these model classes, and so you can create what look like virtual attributes. And so if for whatever reason you wanted to always display the name with the hit points for whatever reason, I could create something like a combined name where I return the Pokemon's name and hit points. And I now have access to this combined name thing from both the console or from the view. And so I could show that here inside of a paragraph tag. I could go to p dot combined name and echo that out. And it looks like it's an attribute of my Pokemon class, but it is just a method call. So we can call that a virtual attribute. It doesn't actually get persisted to the database. It's just almost like a little view helper. And so those can be handy to do sort of common tasks that you might want to do on properties if you're combining them or formatting them in particular ways. And so I could go back over here and reload that. And then you see that's that combined name being echoed out. Like so. So I will commit that as well. And then the last thing that I'm going to demonstrate is, so far I've been building things up piecewise rather than allowing Rails to build a bunch of stuff for me. When I first demoed Rails at the beginning of this course, you saw me use scaffolding. So I'm going to give you a quick refresher of that now that you've seen some of the aspects of how Rails does things and how things sort of flow. Seeing scaffolding will now hopefully make a bit more sense as to what it's doing for you. But be forewarned that most Rails programmers don't tend to use scaffolding when building a Rails application, mainly because it's going to provide to you like full CRUD capabilities. And it's fairly rare that you would want a website that exposes full CRUD capabilities to anyone that hits that website. And so you typically sort of don't need everything that the scaffolding does for you. You typically, in a lot of websites, you're just displaying information to the end user, or maybe retrieving a little bit of information, but not allowing sort of the full CRUD tasks. The full CRUD tasks are often left for someone like an administrator who would have those full capabilities. And instead of using scaffolding for an administrator, there's all sorts of wonderful gems out there that will just automatically make a whole administrative backend for you. And they just introspect your database, they build all the forms, it just builds the backend for you, adds usernames and passwords, all in one go. So you don't have to write any of that yourself. It is most definitely acceptable for the project. The first time students found out about that, early on when I was teaching Rails, they sort of thought they were cheating. They were like, oh, we found this thing, and I heard them all sort of snickering at the back of the room. They're like, we're gonna get points for this. It's like only one line of code. I was like, it's fine. Yeah, it's all good. You're supposed to use gems. So yeah, there's a bunch of really nice auto admin gems that will build that backend for you. And I'll demo some of them in class so that you can see their functionality and how they work and sort of what to do to set them up. So I'll do a quick refresher on scaffolding right now. So you can imagine, let's think about what we might need to do for Pokemon. So for Pokemon, we have these types of Pokemon, so it might make sense for there to be a types table in the database that we could store these types in, and then there could be maybe some kind of join table to allow us to have multiple types associated with a particular Pokemon. I won't go so far as to do the whole join, but I will use scaffolding to create the types and the CRUD associated with it, just so that we can see that in action again. And so that's done from the console. Rails G for generate. So when we wanted to generate a model, we did Rails G model. When we wanted to generate a controller, we did Rails G controller. When we want to generate a scaffold, we do Rails G scaffold. I'm a little hesitant to just type because that seems like far too generic to me. But Pokemon type seems almost like too explicit. I don't know. This is just a demo, Kyle. Don't overthink it. So I'll stick with Pokemon type.
Just do it TIPE.
Why?
Because it's unique and it still says type.
I'll leave it with Pokemon type, and we'll go from there. Poketype. There you go. Like archetype, but yeah, Poketype. There you go. That's that. For whatever reason, that feels good to me. And it's. And I'm just going to give it a name, right? I'm not going to worry about anything out right now other than the name. What will be assigned to the database? There will be a primary key automatically assigned named ID, just like every database table in a Rails application. And we'll also get the created at and updated at timestamps. So when I generate this Poketype, it builds a whole bunch of stuff for me, more than if we were just building a model, or more than if we were just building a controller, because it is building the model. So I have a Poketype model now. It is building the migration, which is that description of database changes that are going to be made, and this one is going to describe the creation of this new Poketypes table. Notice it has pluralized types, because that's the Rails convention, is to pluralize the noun for the table. It has built some testing infrastructure for my models. It has set up the routes, and we'll look carefully at those. It has scaffolded the controller for me. So I have a Poketypes controller. A number of views have been created for me. An index view to display all of the Poketypes, an edit view to display a form for editing, a show view to show an individual entry in this database table, a new to show a form to create a new type, and then this thing underscore form is what's called a view partial. You can think of it almost like a method for our views. The edit and the new both need a form, and the form is going to be almost the same in both cases. So the form gets extracted out to this partial, and so that the edit and the new view, they just need to load up this partial. And then they can have a little bit of customized stuff in them for text-based stuff, but they reuse the same form. Okay, git add, git commit, scaffolded. Why did you stop typing? What does that mean? Something has been killed. I know, this is spooky. Did I lose my connection to Vagrant? Yeah. And look at this. This is hanging now.
Really getting shitty build mode out Pokemon in the way?
And look at this. This is not responding.
Linux, please. You can make a joke shit.
Pause recording here. Thank you for your patience. Technical difficulties semi-averted. When I tried to reload the server here, notice the error message that I got. Active record, pending migration error. Rails tries to give you hints, right? We just did some scaffolding, and it's now telling us that migrations are pending and that we have to run Rails DB migrate. It's even telling us we could, specify our environment if we were concerned that we weren't defaulted to development mode, but we are. And so that's okay. This is a normal message that you get when you have pending migrations, and the pending migrations are because we just did that scaffolding. So let me once again try to do this.
Do we know what happened?
Oh, look at this. So it crashed, and now Git is locked because it crashed during a Git commit. So all I got to do is a little bit of this, and I should be good. Scaffolded a new resource for polkatypes.
Do we know what caused the crash?
Nope. G killed. I don't know what that means. I've never had that happen in Vagrant before, but something obviously killed something. Now I need to do my migration, so Rails DB migrate. That'll create the polkatypes database table. And it did. I should now be able to run my server. That will take me back to that main page where I'm displaying the various Pokemon. But I also want to now check out that polkatypes and see if they are see if the full CRUD has been enabled for them. So polka_types. Again, notice the convention. I named my model polkatype in camel case without the underscore, but when the route was created for me, it became polka_types. Same thing goes for the name of the model. So if I went over to my model here, refresh. There's lots of standards. Yeah, there's lots and lots of standards. They're all pretty standard. Once you they're all fairly similar, right? So the way it does this kind of pluralization, the way it goes back and forth between camel case and snake case, you don't have to memorize too many styles of that. But here's like polkatype is the name of our with the snake case for the file name, camel case for the class name. For the controller, we get polka_types_controller, which associates with a polka_types database table. So yeah, there are lots of conventions here, but they sort of flow in the same way across most aspects of the Rails application. So this is the controller that was made for us. I should be able to load that up over here, create a new polkatype. And so let's say grass is my new polkatype. Create it, and then go back, and I see one of them, and I can create the next one, which is poison. And create it, and I have the ability to also view individual types on their own page by way of their primary key. I can also edit types and change them if I want to. I have a whole bunch of routes that were also built for me automatically, and I can see those at the command prompt here if I type Rails routes. It'll show me what those routes look like. A little bit hard to read here when it's sort of going over the edge of my page. So if I just temporarily paste these into here. Oh, thanks. That didn't fix anything. Or it sort of did. I can sort of line things up a little better here. And so what it's telling me here is a few things. It's telling me the names of the routes that were created that exist in my application, the HTTP verbs that they respond to, the URLs that they match to, and the different controller actions that are used with them. And so, for example, if I go to /polkatypes, which I just went to, it should, if I do it by way of a GET request, it should load up the index of that polkatypes controller. That's what got us to this page, so /polkatypes. If I go to new, you can see the URL is now /polkatypes/new. That's listed right here. I GET request to /polkatypes/new will load up the new action of the polkatypes controller, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to go over all of this in another class. What we have created here for us are 7 different routes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. These 2 for update we'll get into a little bit later, but really there's 7. The style of the routing that Rails uses is called RESTful routing, where REST is an acronym that stands for representational state transfer. And this is something that I had a student who just graduated last term contact me and say he's gone through a bunch of interviews, and on a lot of these interviews he was asked about REST specifically. So these were web interviews that he was going to, and he said, well, I remember you mentioned that in class, but you didn't give me enough information to speak intelligently about this during an interview. And so we'll spend some time in this course talking about what is representational state transfer and how Rails sets up these RESTful routes for us. It's yet another convention that Rails makes use of. It's a very common convention when building APIs. And so, and just like anything on the web, you'll read a bunch of articles where people are saying, oh, REST is dead and we don't use REST anymore, we now use X, Y, and Z. All of those X, Y, Z is dead articles are always, somebody who has discovered a new shiny thing. And yes, it might be better, but REST-based APIs are not going away anytime soon. And based on the feedback I had from that student, it's looking like they're still much in demand in industry, or at least the ability to understand and interact with and potentially build APIs that are RESTful, which is a term you'll hear as well, just meaning that the API is RESTful, means that it conforms to the REST pattern for URLs. So we'll spend some time looking at what that means, but just now know that that's what Rails creates for us when it makes scaffolded resources. And it's also, even if people are building up their controllers and their routes themselves in Rails, most programmers will tend towards building out the URL structure in a RESTful manner, just because that's the convention of Rails. So although a lot of people don't use scaffolding in their Rails applications, they often look to scaffolding as a template for how to build Rails applications. And so whenever a new version of Rails comes out, I will scaffold something up and I will look at how the controller is written. And every version, major version of Rails, the controller is written slightly differently to sort of match what the community is doing when they are manually building controllers. So it's a good way to get a hint for how to do all of these things. And so I often just keep a application hanging around that has a scaffolded resource in it so I can reference that scaffolded resource when I am manually building up the pieces of an application. Okay, I think that's all I need to say today. like the rest of how I'll be teaching Rails, I'll be covering a lot of this stuff multiple times because there's just a lot of it, right? And there's a lot of conventions, and it can get overwhelming or confusing. I'll also continue to screencast these lectures so that you can go back and reference things if I've gone too fast for you, or if you need to sort of review this information. The next thing we're going to be looking at in much more detail is going to be routing. So that's where we'll talk about sort of the basics of how to create URL structures that map to different controller actions, and we'll also talk more specifically about REST and RESTful routes. Any questions or comments that have come up as I've been talking today?
Well, it's not really related to anything you've been doing, but I'm just looking at source code for that blog tutorial, and there's a bunch of stuff in the head, like there's some meta tag with some stuff I don't understand.
So what Jade is looking at specifically is you like viewed source on. Okay, so let's go back to just to a fairly basic page. We'll go to our root route, because this is something that is good to mention, because a lot of students will come in and say, like, what is the HTML that Rails is generating for me? Well, let me tell you. There's a bunch of stuff in here. This gets simplified. Again, Rails runs in different modes. And so this will get simplified in production mode. So Rails is very verbose in development mode, and then the output of its HTML gets simplified in development mode. So for example, here you can see we have 4 different CSS files that are being linked to this document. In production mode, all of those CSS documents will be minified, meaning all extraneous spaces will be removed from them. Then they'll all be concatenated into one common asset file, and it'll be included once and only once. Same thing goes for all this JavaScript that's being generated here. It's all separate in development mode. In production mode, that will be, again, minified, uglified, which is like the process of taking JavaScript and turning all of the variables into like single letter variables to save space. It's like a compression technique for JavaScript.
So is this JavaScript actually doing anything? Because all we're like showing on screen is an H2.
Some of it is doing things and some of it isn't. So if we looked at like polkatypes JS, that's that new asset that we just created, or that new resource that we created. If we open that up, there's nothing in there.
Yeah. Okay.
And so it's like a placeholder. If you have JavaScript that's going to be associated with the polkatypes, it's a place to put it. That said, some of this stuff will have JavaScript in it. So this Rails UJS will have JavaScript in it. And so one of the things that I often don't spend too much time on in this course, but is worth noting, is that Rails does a lot of JavaScript-y stuff under the hood for us without us really knowing. So when I'm over at these polkatypes and I'm like navigating between these links, I'm not really just clicking on a link and going to a whole new page by way of HTTP. When I click on this show, what Rails is doing is it will do an AJAX request to the server to find out what the content of the body of the page I'm asking for is, and then it will dynamically update the body of the document that I'm working on. Yeah, to save reloading all of this extra cruft that comes along with every page.
Yeah,
So
I figured it was like under the hood Rails.
So it's basically every link you click in a Rails application is intercepted by JavaScript, and then JavaScript asynchronously does the things that would ordinarily be done had you be clicking on it in a real sort of static page website, and then it dynamically updates the page using the DOM, all to give the application a sort of a snappier experience, and also to save complete round-trip HTTP calls to re-get the next page over and over again. In most cases, you can just ignore that it's doing that and pretend that it's just a regular old application. The technology is called Turbolinks, and it was originally very controversial in the Rails world, and it's now sort of become the norm. So when Turbolinks was first introduced to Rails, a lot of programmers just straight up turned it off and didn't use it because it conflicted with regular JavaScript, but nowadays it's fairly the bugs have sort of been worked out, and it's sort of battle tested. You'll even see it on like when you make requests. GitHub is a Rails application, and when you make requests on GitHub, you see this blue line that goes at the top? That's Turbolinks in action. So a lot of times when you're on GitHub and you're navigating from link to link, you're not making a full page re-request. The Turbolinks is kicking in, and it's fetching just the portion of the page that would change, or fetching just the portion of the page that needs to be displayed, and it might say leave this menu at the top in place, or anything that doesn't change gets left behind, and the stuff that needs to be updated gets updated. And so it's
You can turn it off?
you can turn it off. Yeah, you can turn it off. I think the easiest way to turn it off is in the gem file. There's just the Turbolinks gem, and you remove that. And then there's a few places in the layout file where you can specify that you don't want the Turbolinks to be happening.
Have you ever built an app where it's broken?
Turbolinks and Turbolinks. One of the things that Turbolinks will break, but it's easy to fix, is because the whole page isn't doing a refresh, when you go to another page, if that other page has custom JavaScript that needs to be loaded, it won't be loaded, because you might be expecting it to load on like a DOM content ready, and the DOM content ready event won't fire. The nice thing with Turbolinks is it just gives you a like Turbolinks content ready event that you can bind to instead. And so that's the solution. So there's the few times that I've run into a problem where I've just forgotten about that, and I've bound to the DOM content ready, or used jQuery or something like that automatically binds to DOM content ready, and I've just been like, oh, why is my JavaScript not running? Oh, Turbolinks. I bind to the proper event and it starts working again. Yeah.
Is there like a list of life cycles that we could hook into?
Yes, so there's a whole bunch of Turbolinks life cycles that you can hook into. I don't know them all off the top of my head, other than that, the ready state one. But there is a whole life cycle of.
Turbolinks is the only option for a single page application.
Yeah, so this is like Rails is like single page application, or SPA Lite, right? It's sort of handling all the stuff behind the scenes. The other thing that it offers in terms of SPAs is ActionCable, which allows you to open up WebSockets back to the Rails server and use the WebSocket technology to transfer information back and forth for like real-time applications. So if you were building, say, like a chat application that needed real-time communication, you would use ActionCable to do that along with your Turbolinks. It's very powerful. And that's sort of why we call Rails a full stack environment, because it has all these little things that in other frameworks, or in other, in manual web coding, you would have to add in yourself, or you'd have to pick a library yourself, and Rails has just hand-picked and hand-curated all these things and built them into Rails proper. So that was all brought about by our discussion of what was happening in here. There's some other stuff that's happening in here, like the CRFS token. CSRF token. That stands for cross-site request forgery, which is a common web attack where you have people submitting data, typically like attack or fuzz data, not from your form. So like, say you have a form up, but someone's just like wrote a bot that just submits to endpoints all over the internet, not by way of the form, but just by way of using HTTP. And you can protect forms by using what's called a cross-site request forgery token, which will be in the form. And so when a Rails form gets submitted, it will only be accepted by Rails if it includes the token that was in the form itself. So bots that are just randomly hitting endpoints, their data will just straight up be dropped because it doesn't include the token. Now, it is hackable, right? You could go to the form, find the token, and submit it along with your attack, but now you have to specialize your attack to every individual form, or your bot has to be aware. It has lots and lots of security stuff built right in. Same for like cross-site request and SQL injection attacks as well.
Does that mean that every page now has to hit a database, or does that mean, or can they store store that in session?
That's auto stored in session, I imagine. It's definitely not in the database, and I'm guessing that it's in session. And so yeah, that's what this stuff up at the top is. Then you have all of these, which will be compressed down to single assets when we go into production mode, and that's really the bulk of what's happening inside of the layout here.
Yeah, I just thought like, what was a simple page that has all this like stuff?
All the stuff, right? And that's why Rails can often feel a little bit like overkill when you first come to it, because it is this full stack thing. So it has all of these features and capabilities that if you were just building a really simple application, you might not need. For that, there's Sinatra. So if you ever want to take a look at a wonderful singer, you could look up Frank Sinatra. If you wanted a very slim web application, you would look up Sinatra RB. And Sinatra RB is a way of writing really lightweight web applications that just don't have all of the things that Rails has. So you can make really, really lightweight APIs with Sinatra. Let's see if they have do you have a really quick demo for us somewhere here? Yeah, so this is a Sinatra app. That's the extent of it. It's just that many lines long, and this app has a route for slash that will echo out the words hello world. So you specify what HTTP verb you want to respond to, the URL you want to respond to, and what the response should be, and that's it. That's your entire web app. So for building, it's super cool. And there's Sinatra has been cloned in a whole bunch of different languages. So if you look for like C# Sinatra clone or like Python Sinatra clone, you'll find a version of Sinatra for whatever technology you're working with, and it can be really, really nice for mocking up APIs or straight up just building really, really tiny and fast APIs. And so yeah, Sinatra's really, really a nice thing. Here's sort of a more complicated RESTful application where you have a get request to slash that does something, but also a post request to slash might do something else, and a put request to slash might replace something. So it supports all the regular HTTP verbs. It's a very, very powerful thing. And it's another example of what in the Ruby world is called a domain-specific language, or a DSL, right? Because get is not a keyword in Ruby. It's just part of this DSL for building simple web applications.
So just really quick, you use Sinatra before, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So when you say like get / and you hear you have this get / foo, which one are you going to default to with get request? So is it going to look at get / and then we obviously have stuff after that into request, and if that happens to be something else, is it always going to default to the slash first, or do you put the foo before the slash?
It'll match. It's like a greedy match. So it'll go as yeah. No, it'll do the foo. Like so it'll.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So greedy as in it'll chomp up as many characters and try to match the maximum rather than the minimum.
Okay, cool.
And then you can also have like, this is how you would get a parameter in, like a get param, right? So hello name, you could put /hello /anything, and then inside of this params hash, you would get access to that name, similar to the PHP get superglobal, for example. Ben?
Yeah. I was just saying, like you said, it's a different language. It's not get isn't a method that has a parameter.
It sort of is a method, right? But it's sort of making it look like it's its own little programming language. But it is like behind the scenes in the Sinatra gem, get is defined as a method that takes an argument and a block as part of its part of its.
Oh, so is the block a parameter?
Yes, yeah, yeah. The block is a parameter. So that get is a method that takes both a string and a block. And so yeah, one of your parameters in Ruby methods can be blocks, and that's something I don't go into too much in this course because it's rather advanced. But that's one of the most common ways of making DSLs in Ruby is creating methods that take not only arguments but also blocks.
Sweet.
It's really a powerful, powerful way of doing things, and the blocks can even yield to block arguments as well. So you get some really powerful things. So yeah, if you're curious, check out Sinatra. It's a really, really cool application. And as I said, if you Google for Sinatra clones or Sinatra equivalents, you'll find those in a lot of different programming languages. I think the C# one might be called Nancy, and Nancy Sinatra was Frank Sinatra's wife. I think his daughter was also named Nancy Sinatra, so that's a little confusing. But yeah, I think the C# one is called Nancy. I think that's where we'll leave it. And so let me stop this